Hello and welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of European Pharmaceutical Review and Altasciences, I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'm your moderator today. My name is Hannah Balfour and I'm the Assistant Editor of European Pharmaceutical Review. Today's keynote speakers will be Ingrid Holmes, Vice President, Global Clinical Operations at Altasciences, and Dr. Beatrice Setnik, Chief Scientific Officer at Altasciences. Following their presentation, we will move on to a live question and answer session where you can pose questions to today's speakers. Please remember you can submit your questions at any point during the webinar using the questions panel situated in the menu on the right. Before I hand it over to today's keynote speakers, we do have a couple of poll questions for you. So our first question is, in which country would you prefer to conduct your early phase clinical trials? Ten-second warning, any last responses? There we go. So our second question for you today is, what are the three most common outsourcing challenges that you face with respect to early phase clinical trials? Great, thank you for participating. And our final question, what are the three most important criteria that you consider when selecting a contract research organisation or CRO? Fabulous. Thank you for your votes. I will now pass it over to today's keynote speakers, Ingrid Holmes and Dr. Beatrice Setnik.
Hello, and welcome to Altasciences, A Leap Across the Pond, discovering the many advantages of conducting early phase clinical trials in North America. My name is Beatrice Setnik. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of Altasciences, and I'm joined by my colleague Ingrid Holmes, VP of Global Clinical Operations. So for our introduction, we're going to be looking at several different things, including the strategies for accelerating drug development programs with studies conducted in North America. We are going to give an overview on how to navigate regulatory submissions in both the US and in Canada. We'll talk about the diverse study volunteer access in North America and discuss some common challenges, solutions, and opportunities when conducting your early phase studies, particularly in the North American regions. Global clinical trials are conducted throughout the world, and as you can see here, for the ones that are listed on clinicaltrials.gov, of the near 400,000 studies, the US is the predominant site for conduct of studies. They're conducted in all 50 states, across 220 countries across the world. The majority of them are non-US. However, a great segment of 32% are conducted only in the US, whereas an additional 5% are conducted in the US and outside. So North America continues to be the leading player in the clinical study conduct. There are many other advantages for sponsors attempting to start their clinical programs in North America, particularly because the United States continues to be the leader in the market for pharmaceutical sales. The graph here shows global pharmaceutical sales between 2017 to 2020. As you can see here in the blue bars, the world total for sales in billions of US dollars of pharmaceuticals. The United States, shown in the black bars, continues to be the dominant player for global pharmaceutical sales compared to the emerging markets in gray, Europe in red, and the established rest of the world in green. Early phase studies come with their own challenges, and some of the most common concerns related to the clinical trials have come from sponsor insight and surveys that we've conducted. Not surprisingly, the most common areas of concern relating to clinical trials include areas of the pricing of the study, the timelines, the regulatory requirements, particularly when approaching other countries, the recruitment and retention of subjects, the quality of the study and the data outputs, and the communication between the sponsors and the CROs and other providers for the study. It's without a doubt that both efficiency and quality are integral to phase 1 studies. Many of the critical go decisions that are needed for drug development will be data dependent and predominantly conducted early in the clinical development programs. However, one of the interesting aspects of sponsor insight has shown us that both Canada and the United States are ranked top for preferred locations, probably related to the fact that most sponsors will be targeting their final NDA submissions to the United States eventually. On the first topic of pricing, what's behind the dollar? I think one of the most important things is to really understand the budget, particularly when starting clinical trials and determining different pricing strategies across different multiple contract research organizations. Oftentimes, the budget changes throughout the development program, and then sponsors are sometimes surprised that there are increasing creeping costs to a study design. However, there are ways to mitigate this and be strategic upfront with the budgeting to find the CRO that will provide the best quality at a reasonable costing. One of the things that we've encountered over the years is in the request for proposals. When we are given a lack of study design details, these lead often to ballpark costs, which are more estimates. When these are given to multiple vendors for price comparisons, different interpretation of clinical designs can lead to different budgetary costs, and therefore the comparison between one sponsor or one CRO versus another is not really apples to apples. So the more study design details provided up front gives you more precision in costing and then being able to make more meaningful comparisons, particularly when you're reaching out to multiple vendors for quoting. It's also important when you're looking at budgets to not only look at the details, but also read the fine print. There are many pass-through costs, including stipends and monitoring, that will be inevitably a part of the study cost, but are not necessarily specified. And those need to also be accounted for in the total cost, particularly when you're budgeting. It's also very important to understand that protocol amendments and changes can result in increased costing. This is for the reason why Altasciences, our teams here, will do a thorough feasibility analysis and make recommendations on protocol design changes that may be anticipated to ensure study integrity. This helps sponsors identify what those costs may be and what changes may be foreseeable. Certainly when we have issues with either contracting, with drug delivery, or with recruitment, these can result in costly delays. So identifying sites that have rapid access to patients and study volunteers are very important. And within North America, we have a reasonably very good access to patients, which can avoid costly delays. There are also unforeseen costs related to monitoring, amendments, and study rescue. We have been in a position where we've had to rescue studies in the past, and that can also lead to more time and budgetary implications. The other advantages that sponsors will take a look at when deciding geographically the location of where they would like to conduct their study is not only the regulatory strategy, but also perhaps other benefits like tax credits or other incentives that are offered by different regulatory agencies and countries. Understanding the nuances is important because oftentimes these countries will require that an entity of the company exists in that country. And also another part of the budgetary aspect is the handling of the currency exchanges, knowing that those are subject to fluctuation, and depending on when the study milestone payments are made, those may fluctuate with time too. So there's certainly a lot of different pricing considerations to take into consideration. And I'll ask my colleague Ingrid if you have any additional thoughts on the budget, because I know we've gone through a lot of these over the years where there have been significant changes and things that have occurred that may create changes in budgetary.
Yeah, thanks, Beatrice. No, I think you summarized it very thoroughly. I think, really, as our sponsors, particularly those outside of North America, are looking at comparing pricing across different regions, all of these bullet points that you summarized do really need to be very carefully considered, but they also need to be weighed against other elements within their program, such as timing, access to patients, the quality that can be expected from the region that may be proposing that budget. All of that needs to factor in so that you can make a well-balanced decision. But it's very important to understand all of this.
Yes, absolutely. And that's really why I think this is an important determination early on in the clinical development, particularly when you're starting to look at your regulatory strategies and what your end game is for your regulatory submissions, and certainly having access to countries where you plan to file. And we'll get into that more later, but there can be advantages of having those regulatory interactions with those agencies upfront earlier in your development program. So we'll go ahead and move on. There are also different ways of finding and evaluating efficiencies in drug development. So as you know, the drug development process is a lengthy one involving various stages of drug development, ranging from the discovery, preclinical, throughout the clinical and post-marketing studies. Having a CRO that is able to navigate through different phases can be rather beneficial. And this is really because the study teams, when you have a CRO or a partner that has that is proficient in different areas of the clinical development pathway, then you can have good transference of phases of drug development from one phase to another. So for example, at Altasciences, we have a strategy in place for the efficient movement of our study programs from preclinical, from manufacturing preclinical over to the early phase clinical development program by having teams in place that are communicating with one another and transferring program knowledge from one group to the other. And so as a molecule progresses from the preclinical work over to the clinical work, there's a lot of that interaction that takes place internally so that the transition is very smooth, leading to efficiencies in project management and in other areas. And this also helps the sponsor to be able to really often guide them from one stage to the next. Sometimes companies are more siloed or fragmented, or the groups work separately. But at Altasciences, we really come together to try to make the transition as easiest as possible between phases. And this becomes really important in being able to make strategic decisions early in your development programs, even in the preclinical studies, to know and to foresee what can potentially come up during the IND submissions, for example, and what may be needed from the early clinical studies upfront, and certainly helping with a team of regulatory experts and staff and experts that are very well versed with the regulatory approval processes, that what the regulatory strategy may be for, perhaps, for example, for an IND. So now I'll have my colleague Ingrid go over the regulatory and strategic considerations for conducting studies within North America and in other geographic locations.
Thank you, Beatrice. So as Beatrice alluded to on the previous slides, the decisions our sponsors are making are often global decisions. They are multifaceted in that there are a lot of things to consider. And this can often be segmented into the different phases of clinical research. But in essence, when we're talking about early phase decisions of where to place that work, most of our clients are making a decision based on what is rate limiting in an area, and they're also focusing on the future submission strategy for their drug. They have to balance a lot of different things as they're making those decisions. And what we're fortunate about in North America, and Beatrice showed you on the previous slide, is that there is a similarity and, of course, a collegiality to how research is performed across Europe and North America. The regulations are similar. They do have a variety of differences, but there can be advantages for picking one over the other, depending on your overall situation that you're in. So what our sponsors are typically looking at, and hopefully very proactively, is, of course, their timing. What is the major goal for this program or for this study in terms of when do they need to get their data, and how is that going to influence future steps they take within the program? They're, of course, also looking at any prior interaction they've had with a variety of agencies, whether that's positive or negative. They're always learning something, but that will also guide them to decisions about where to place work in the future and potentially alter their market authorization strategy as well. They should be looking at population statistics of the areas where they need to conduct the research. This will lead to potentially niche sites that have access to the patients that they need, and along with those patients, KOLs that can help guide them throughout the program. And when they're looking at their future strategies, it's not just about thinking about where is their first submission going to be, what country or what region. It is also going to be, in the end, what does the entire package look like? And as Beatrice mentioned, is the end goal a US submission? And how do we get there as quickly as possible? They will also be looking at potential competitive edge to their label as they are going to submit. Are there existing drugs that they will be competing with in certain countries, in certain regions that have labeling claims that they've made or restrictions that they could compete with? And that may allow them to study those drugs head to head potentially and gain leverage with their label submission of their own. They'll be looking at timelines to get top-line data to help them with future submissions and future studies. And of course, the dollars behind the research, investor-related strategies are very important. In some cases, investors are going to be mandating that certain work is done in certain areas. And if they're not only relying on investors, they may be looking at grant opportunities, in which case those grants may be afforded to them, but restricted to areas of either the country or the world that the grant was issued from. So we thought we'd do a quick side-by-side comparison of the three major regions that our sponsors are looking to conduct their research in, not just potential filing for market authorization, but also where they're conducting the work. As you know, our clinics actually at Altasciences are located right now in North America, 2 in the US and 1 in Canada. We are looking to expand that into Europe, knowing that this will also help a lot of our clients. As of today, we sit in North America. So looking at the FDA and how it compares with EMA, CTA, and the Health Canada clinical trial application, they all have a lot of similarities and some advantages and disadvantages to them that may help guide decisions. The IND, of course, is probably the most well-known to all of us here, in that it's a 30-day default review. They will definitely get back to you with information requests. And once you are in your holding pattern, you're usually safe to proceed after that 30-day default has exceeded. The risk to this, of course, and what everyone's afraid of, is that you may get yourself placed on a hold for an undefined period, which can be quite challenging for sponsors, making them look out to other regions. You also have a risk of potentially getting communication after that 30-day default review, which can put a wrench in some of the work you may have started. When you're looking at an EMA CTA, the advantages here, of course, are that you are submitting to member states, and there's a harmonized approach for each trial across that entire dossier. The disadvantages are the timelines that are associated with these CTAs. They're longer than in North America. So in the long run, you may have access to more countries and more able to conduct that trial across a broader area within Europe, but it may take you longer to set that up and get there. And then Health Canada is somewhere in between the two in terms of both timing and approach. In Canada, you have one CTA filed for each trial, whereas in the US, you actually have a dossier developed for that program. So each new trial, you need a new CTA in Canada. There is a 30-day default review for all innovator trials in Canada that's supplemented with CMC information that is very similar to what you would see in Europe and for an IND. The big difference for Canada is that at that 30-day end, you will definitively know whether you were able to proceed. You will receive information in terms of a no objection letter that allows you to either go on or a non-satisfactory notice, which would mean that you cannot proceed. In terms of CMC, as I mentioned earlier, these are very, very similar across all three applications. In Europe, there is something to be aware of in that each member state may actually determine a level of information that needs to be submitted. So we'd have to take that into consideration. Of course, protocols, informed consents, and other drug information is required for each submission. And in terms of the reporting requirements, they are similar, but the US does require an annual report, whereas Canada does not, and Europe will require a safety report updated as part of the review package. So we thought we'd take a quick look at some of the timeline differences between the submissions. Mentioned earlier that Europe definitely is a little longer with EMA in terms of the initial submission. You also have the IRBs, which can be a little more challenging across different countries, having very different rules that some of them apply in Europe versus North America. But when you're comparing Canada versus the US, which a lot of our ex-North American sponsors are looking to compare between the two, you can see that the timelines are fairly similar. You gain about a maximum of 5 days submitting to Canada, and there is a little bit less information that's required. So you can get going a little quicker in Canada versus the US, and you will definitely know at that 30-day mark a definitive start date for the trial. But overall, the timelines are very similar between the IND and the Canadian CTA. So why would a US sponsor opt to come to Canada? This is a strategy that we see very often. We can look at our Canadian site, and I can tell you that approximately 30% of our work comes from Europe, and over 60% are actually US sponsors. There's, of course, strategic reasons for that. Beatrice went through some of them in terms of pricing. A lot of that has to do with study timing as well. It could also be site and therapeutic expertise. Does the site actually have very good experience running a certain type of trial or pulling in a certain type of subject or patient into the study as well? There's also a strategy where the US may have put them on a hold, and Canada will review that independently. Of course, you do need to divulge any refusals in the past for your program, but they will review it as a standalone submission and take all of that into account. So that is a strategy for many of our sponsors. And additionally to that, we do have quite a few of our US sponsors who prefer to gain a little bit of information and data for their program prior to filing their IND. So when they go into that pre-IND meeting, they actually have some information to share and it can be quite strategic for them in that way. Why would a Canadian sponsor go to the US? Well, definitely some of these reasons are going to be the same, just the opposite. So they may have site and therapeutic expertise, and knowing that the size of the US is approximately 10 times larger in population than Canada, there definitely are opportunities to have a much larger scale of access to sites, patients, of course, and CROs. CTA challenges can occur just the same way an IND challenge can occur. So they may have had an issue in Canada where they cannot get over that hurdle and they would like to place the work in the US, and they'd go there. Investor milestones to pressure an open IND or to open an IND. This is very common. We see this very often where part of the strategy for that sponsor is to hit that milestone of filing an IND in the US. So they may not need to run the study there, but it strategically makes sense for them, and it's really a mandate from their investors. And of course, gaining early feedback from the FDA is critical if the end goal is a market submission, an NDA submission for the US. And then why would our European sponsors opt to come to North America? Again, a lot of these are going to be consistent, but really the timelines are huge in many cases, especially these days with the backlog from the pandemic in many CROs and recruiting challenges in certain areas of Europe that we have been seeing over the last few years have really pushed some to come to Canada and the US more often than they would have in the past. There also is, of course, geographic reasons for site and therapeutic expertise across the board. Some studies are just conducted much more often. It could be based on regulation. It could just be based on how things have naturally built up over the years in certain regions. But this is definitely something that we see. An example of that would be abuse liability studies. There are regulatory requirements for those studies to happen for market authorization in Canada and in the United States. If a European sponsor was developing that way, they would have to conduct those studies here, because in Europe, there is not so much of a similar expectation. Therefore, those studies are much lower occurring in those areas. And really, again, going back to that early FDA feedback, it's a future market authorization strategy. It's very important for our sponsors to get that in early to help guide their program. In terms of enriching your IND, we mentioned that on the last couple of slides. This can be very, very helpful for our clients to come in with data, get first in human or early pilot data outside of the US, have it in their pocket, go into their pre-IND meeting with data that they can actually discuss with the FDA. It's not only important to certain types of drug development and certain types of sponsors, it may also link you back to a problem you may have had on your existing program in the US. So if for some reason you've bumped into something with an open IND and the FDA is potentially pushing you in a certain direction that a sponsor may not agree with scientifically, they could run a study to look at that issue outside of the US, gain the data, and bring it back to discuss with the FDA. The earlier that happens within the program, usually the better, in terms of not getting too far down the line and then having to go back and correct for issues, or getting stuck in an issue and a circular discussion with the agency as well. It really is important in terms of developing the critical path for the development plan and to have healthy engagement with the FDA in terms of those discussions. It can also help you determine any special program requirements and safety assessments that you may need to be looking at more concretely in the future. So we often have clients coming to us asking about what are the differences between North America and Australia. There is quite a lot of competition for particularly the first in human and early phase trials with regulations that are available in Australia that are quite favorable, not just from a GMP standpoint, but also from a tax credit and an early review standpoint. It can facilitate the research. So I put up Canada versus Australia here just because in general they are quite similar. The CTAs, the process itself is quite competitive, and very often when we are competing with other CROs for work, Canada is in the running with Australian CROs. Those are usually our clients that are looking for timing and tax credit benefits within their first-in-human program. So you're seeing here that there is a CTA that's going to be filed for each trial. They are trial specific. The timeline is definitely longer in Australia than in Canada. It can take up to 3 months potentially to get through your review. The submission itself is a little simpler, and in both cases, the annual reviews are not required. So the Australian submission is actually a little simpler than the CTA content that's required for Canada, but overall the timing is longer. And that's well depicted on this slide, where you can see that the overall submission is at least 3 weeks shorter for Canada versus Australia. Of course, then what you need to factor in is the whole picture, as we discussed earlier. You may be looking at a shorter lead time to get going in Canada. What you would need to discuss with the other country, of course, then is everything else. What are the other factors? So what are the financial implications? How quickly can those sites recruit and complete the trial? All of that needs to go into developing the overall program timeline and what is the objective, what's most important for you as a sponsor. And I'll pass it back to Beatrice to discuss a few other options.
Thank you, Ingrid. So for regulatory strategies, also another advantage of coming to the US is that the FDA provides various FastTrack designations for sponsors that can vastly improve the timelines for drug development, accelerate approvals, and gives increased access of a sponsor to the FDA for input more frequently through the development process for a drug. And these can be done for depending on if a drug fulfills the criteria for such designations, but if it's being used to meet an unmet medical need, if there are any ways that there's an improvement as a breakthrough therapy, there may be unmet medical needs that may be require a surrogate endpoint that can be approved for a priority review. And there's also the accelerated approval process that shortens the goal for action by the FDA within 6 months for a priority review. So there are certainly advantages of taking that. And in order to be able to take advantage of these types of designations, you would have to open up an IND in the United States. And as Ingrid mentioned, having some of that data up front as you open the IND from ex-US countries can sometimes be very helpful and strategic to show some more clinical data as you're also progressing and proceeding to obtain these types of fast-track designations. So there's a variety of different strategies that can be done to accelerate timelines and to have those meaningful regulatory interactions to help guide the program and to get to the marketing stage as quickly as possible. The relationship with Health Canada, for example, Altasciences, we conduct a very high proportion of Canadian phase 1 studies, and we routinely submit to the FDA. So our interactions with these agencies are very frequent. And even though in some cases the requirements change over time, or unique drugs come to market that require unique considerations from a regulatory point of view, it's beneficial to have a sponsor that operates in multiple countries like this, because you can have the perspectives of different regulatory agencies that can help align with the strategy for a sponsor's drug development program. The graph here that you're seeing is our phase 1 studies that have gone through the 30-day default review. In the blue, you see the studies, the CTAs that Altasciences has submitted between 2016 and 2020. And this is in comparison to Health Canada, all the CTAs that have been submitted to Health Canada. So in generally, across all the CTAs submitted to the Health Canada agency, Altasciences represents about 20 to 30% on an annual basis. So you can see we have a substantial amount of work, a piece of the Canadian research that's being performed up in Canada, which gives us a very frequent interactions with the agencies and 99% successful CTA submissions. But that really comes with the territory of doing these so frequently for so many different unique drugs and conditions and drug development programs that we're able to navigate these regulatory agencies with ease. Now for the next section of our presentation, we'll be discussing ease of access and risk mitigation for early phase clinical trials. North America generally provides a convenient location globally. We have close proximity to both the Asia Pacific, Europe, and the time zones are aligned within the US and Canada. So this also provides enhanced communication when you're dealing with different time zones and different countries. And we have a very close, convenient travel proximity to many different other countries. I think one of the unique features of Altasciences is what I had mentioned earlier about transitioning clients from different phases of drug development research and from study to study. And that's really made possible by the fact that we're a nimble CRO that really focuses on communication and internal communication, which is one of the areas that frequently comes up as an area for concern with sponsors. And our tell us once approach is a promise that you'll never repeat yourself. When you're in your very early stages in drug development, whether you're in our manufacturing group or with preclinical, we have a proprietary database that captures information so that we understand what your preferences are, what your study requirements may be, unique information to you that will help us guide and help you navigate the programs as you go transition from one study to another. And we also have the study results and history and very close communication with our teams to be able to transition the information so that you're not having to repeat yourself. And we're finding those efficiencies in communication and in your development process. So it's cost and time savings for you. Part of planning for success is also understanding that things may go awry and that risk mitigation and understanding how to mitigate challenges when they do arise and if they do arise is important in preparedness for a good clinical trial. So the redundancy options for recruitment or other challenges that may be encountered, the risk mitigation is an approach that's taken upfront from the very beginning. Any challenges that are foreseen are communicated to the sponsor. Oftentimes, there's always a possibility of modifying elements of a study design to mitigate those risks upfront. However, if there are things that may unexpectedly occur, and you've seen things with, for example, COVID, you have the kind of black swan events that may occur, and being able to respond and to respond quickly and adapt is a considerable benefit. And I think our sites have been really leading the way and really going through these challenging times with a lot of efficiency and being able to continue to conduct the clinical work despite global pandemics. And so the COVID-19 risk mitigation was also an unforeseen event, yet it was one where we were able to pick up and be able to continue clinical work and the studies that were in progress with our sponsors. So this is really our approach. We have partnerships with many other vendors and service providers. Our philosophy is rather than a competition, it's really more about collaboration and unifying with other areas or other experts or service providers that can enhance the clinical trials. We have native speakers for multiple languages. So when there's translation of documents or going into different regions, we're able to quickly adapt for that, and very highly specialized networks that are able to conduct or recruit patients or do certain arms of studies where they may have access or specific expertise or instrumentation or any other clinical needs that are required for a study protocol. And so being prepared and understanding where those risks may lie helps to mitigate and navigate it successfully throughout the study without having any major interruptions to a clinical trial. One of the other things to think about is the FDA acceptance of foreign clinical studies. And the FDA put out a guidance on this several years ago. And it is important to consider because like I showed with the pharmaceutical sales data, the US is still one of the most sought after countries for filing drug applications. And it's very important how the FDA deems foreign data to ensure that you're meeting the quality requirements of what the FDA will accept for the NDA submission at the end of the day. And in their documentation, they talk about the things that can happen where there may be a higher probability of a site being audited outside of the U.S. And when you have situations in where only foreign data is submitted to support the application, or there's insufficient domestic data, or there's domestic and foreign data that show conflicting results that are very relevant to the decision making, whether it be on efficacy or safety, or there's a serious issue to resolve, such as suspicion of fraud or misconduct or other human right subject protection violations, these can trigger audits. And depending on the amount of FDA staff that are available in those foreign countries to audit, that can cause significant timelines and delays. So being able to balance a program with both ex-US and US sites helps to mitigate some of those risks that may potentially trigger an audit down the road. So it's very important to balance the drug development program in terms of the geographic locations, and then to be very careful in the selection of quality sites whenever you're doing research anywhere within the world. And now I'll hand it over to Ingrid to walk us through participant recruitment.
Thank you, Beatrice. So you know, we keep bringing up the concept of a balanced approach for where to place the clinical work, and of course, the patient or participant access is a major driver behind those decisions. Going through just a few of the considerations and bullet points here that would be really important to think about. And then tying this back into North America, you know, why is it advantageous or potentially going to be a good fit for those sponsors that actually aren't located in North America? I think just in general, wherever you're going to do the work, these are things you'd want to think about. But thinking back to that population slide that Beatrice showed earlier, across, you know, the Canadian and US landscape, how many languages do we speak here? What is the diversity of our population? How large is the population in the areas in which we work? All of those things are really important to consider. If you were going into a new CRO or a new site, and if you were looking for a partner in this area that was going to be recruiting efficiently and getting you to those milestones quickly, these are all really important. So you're looking at cities that have large population access, a density around the site, ideally, especially if you're looking at a normal, healthy population to bring into those early phase or clin pharm studies. You certainly want to look at a site or a CRO with a strong research history. That's not just going to help you get good quality of data, but it's also going to ensure that they're well known within the population, that they have a strong database, you know, with many years behind it, so that they can stand up and recruit quickly. If you're looking more for a patient population proof of concept study, you definitely won't want to look for a specialty network, ideally with several hospital centers in the area that have good research ability and time to devote to it as well. That can also be challenging. And you'd want to look at the ethnicities and the diverse populations within the area that you're doing the research. This may or may not be as important depending on the drug you're studying, but definitely there's an expectation of agencies to represent the population that this drug will be marketed for, and you need to consider that when you're placing the work. Definitely healthcare systems within the region the study will be conducted can be important. There may be different treatment paradigms in place. There may be different ways that patients are placed on a treatment regimen, certain medications that are maybe not covered by their healthcare system that they may have a benefit from conducting the trial and participating on the trial. And this is also advantageous for many sponsors when they're looking at placing a certain drug within a certain country. Similar conversation would be transit systems. You know, can these patients get back and forth easily to the site? How hard is it going to be for them to participate and be compliant during the participation? And then you want that site to be able to be metric driven on their recruitment. You really want to know that they have a strategy to bring that study in well, and that they're not just relying on past success, that they actually have a plan for your study and that they're going to be tracking it appropriately. So as an example of looking at, you know, how Altasciences sits, and of course this is a microcosm of the research landscape in North America, but we've been strategically placing our clinics east, west coast, and in the middle of the country, in the Midwest and Kansas, to ensure that we do cover those geographic areas for our clients, both from where our clients are based, but also because of the populations in those areas that can help them with the trials they run. We collectively, just across our 3 sites, have a combined database of over 400,000 historic participants. You know, if you were to add that up with all the other CROs in North America, this is really, really significant. It's a great place to recruit healthy volunteers, absolutely, for early phase work. I think Beatrice mentioned on a previous slide, you know, competition versus collaboration. That really extends to our competitors as well. It's not just about, let's say, an open enrollment trial, but more and more in North America, you've seen a consolidation of some of the larger CROs in some cases, but also an increase in specialty sites. And what that's meant is that those of us that have been around for a while have realized that we're much better when we work together collaboratively than when we compete head-to-head on things. So you actually have a spirit of collaboration. You have an understanding that the end goal here is absolutely to get the best data as quickly as possible to our sponsors. And we see that collaboration happening more and more. And that can extend into participant recruitment as well. So it could be an intra-company strategy, such as a large study that could be conducted across Altasciences' 3 sites, let's say, where we could get to the end goal of recruitment and 3 times faster than just using 1 site. It could also mean that we bring on additional sites outside of our areas to help speed that along outside of our network with other sites and other CROs. So we were talking about having data-driven results. Again, these are really, really important metrics. CROs and sites that have been around for enough time understand this really well. There has to be a strategy in place for each study. There has to be a detailed feasibility and risk mitigation done, particularly about the recruitment of these participants and ensuring that we can commit to the study and the timeline as well. What we have found that works exceptionally well is to have dedicated call centers at each of our sites. Most sites will operate in this way. Some of our colleagues across the industry will also, you know, use sort of outsourced recruitment agencies. We found that can potentially sometimes help with bringing in patient work, but most often with the early phase work, doing it ourselves with people that we work with that are dedicated to our sponsors' trials is the best way to go. Because of that, we've got these enormous databases historically across our clinics, and they are completely metric driven. These databases were put together in order to be able to house a lot of very important information on demographics, on each of those participants and their medical history, so that we can, you know, really efficiently recruit. We definitely want to ensure that we have multilingual call center staff. This would extend into the study participant pool, and ensuring that we conduct the trial in the language of the choice of the participant. That opens up access to lots of additional people who can participate in your trial, and the tracking of what the results are to ensure that when we are spending money on media, when we are doing outreach, that we actually have very quick turnaround on what's working and what isn't working so that we can adjust quickly. What that translates into for Altasciences is we are above 95% on time to committed panel sizes and dates annually. And this is a great statistic. It's fairly reflective of North America as well. Not every CRO will be this high, but it is a really good indication, I'd say, across North America of how these sites do. And this is not the case everywhere in the world right now. Recruitment can be quite a challenge. So in terms of quality, of course, this can trump everything else. So we thought we'd spend a minute or two on this. So what we want to ensure, of course, is that we have, in the end, acceptability of the data that we collect, and that we are not just performing high quality studies, but that our studies will be well recognized wherever they are submitted in the end. So how Altasciences accomplishes this is it's multifactorial, of course, but really it starts with the fundamentals of our procedures. We have SOPs that are compliant with Health Canada, US, EMA, and MHRA requirements, and that's done on purpose. I mentioned earlier that our client base is about 30% Europe, 65% US, and the rest is rest of world. So we definitely need to ensure we understand those regulations and that our SOPs reflect them. That's both for the clinic, bioanalysis, and all of our other departments. We need to have that in order to be trusted by those agencies and by our sponsors from those regions to place work with us. We definitely are benefiting from the sharing of quality standards across North America and Europe, which has really improved a global understanding, let's just say, of how work should be conducted over the last several years. So North America is right there along with Europe in terms of, what are the mandates in each region and how can we all comply to them. And then there is a robust adoption, of course, in North America of E6R2. And, we all recognize that this is the bedrock, the foundation of how to conduct safe and ethical research. So just in terms of the regulatory experience, I'll give you a slide here that we present at Altasciences. And again, this can be extended to other CROs within North America will have a similar approach. But what you can see here, and I was explaining earlier about the diversity of countries that we work with or areas that will be submitted to, you can see by the little flags here that, of course, the predominant inspection number of inspections that we have at Altasciences is from the US FDA. And that is, of course, generated by the number of studies that we conduct that are intended for FDA submission. But you can also see that there are lots of other countries involved across the board. So we've been inspected by Health Canada, by Spain, by the Thai FDA. We have an ANVISA certification at our Montreal location for both the clinic and the bioanalysis facility. And we've had multiple MHRA inspections, as well as other European countries and WHO. We're in good standing with all of these agencies. And the reason for that really is that we base our procedures on complying to their requirements. So if I use, let's say, MHRA as an example, they're known across the industry of having probably the toughest GCP standards in terms of not just how we complete the clinic, but also pharmacy requirements. We don't have to comply with that at 100% in North America, but we base our standards on those principles within our procedures so that when they come to inspect us, they see it reflected and they know that we are thinking through the future of this drug and the future of where it's going to be submitted, and can the work stand alone, even though it was conducted outside of the UK, can it stand alone and comply to those standards? And yes, it can. So this is an advantage of working in North America. We have lots of sites that are used to working with global providers and global sponsors. And we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Ingrid Holmes and Dr. Beatrice Setnick, for your excellent presentations. I now have the pleasure of introducing our question and answer session, where today's speakers will answer all of your questions. Please don't forget, you can still submit questions using the questions panel in the menu on the right. So let's take a look at our first question. Can you run a study in Canada if it is on clinical hold in the United States?
I can answer that one.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Beatrice. So yes, you can. The two countries have independent review, as we discussed earlier, in terms of a CTA versus an IND. So it happens actually quite often that sponsors who are placed on a hold in the US will submit a CTA in Canada. It's reviewed independently. You do, of course, have to declare and report that you are on a hold, or any other issues, refusals that you may have had along the way with, let's say, ethics. But the Canadian agency will review it independently, and they'll make their own decision. So quite often, the studies we're conducting at our clinic in Montreal actually are those that are on a hold in the States.
Great, thank you. And how has COVID-19 affected study conduct, and is there any sort of regional effect in this?
Yeah, I could probably start that one off. I would say, of course, it's affected everyone. What I'm very proud of is across our clinics, really the gear up and the ability to keep going and keep our programs going where it was safe to do was very, very quick. So in terms of recruitment, what did we see? Definitely at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw some subjects and patients who were reluctant to participate. I think that makes perfect sense. We also, of course, put limits on our own in terms of how much could we handle capacity-wise at each site, and implemented testing as quickly as possible. We also saw a higher attrition rate. Again, I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of, people were potentially off of work, on furlough, working remotely, having to deal with childcare issues, that type of thing. So a lot of unexpected issues coming up. So we accounted for that by really just over recruiting prior to the start of the trial. But once the patients were in the trial, we really haven't seen much of a higher dropout rate at all. It has translated, I would say, into a higher stipend. That's pretty consistently reported across North America. The increases are different depending on the area of North America that you're in, what city. But I think sponsors should be ready to account for that right now. But you can still find the subjects. You just are going to need to pay a little more for it.
Thank you, Ingrid. This one's a slightly long one, so bear with me. Can we do the phase 2/3 efficacy studies intended for US FDA submission completely outside of the US, or do they need to have any ratio of subjects between US and other countries?
I can start off this one. So usually for phase 2 studies, a lot of sponsors may choose to go outside of North America, but if you're intending to file an NDA, at some point you will be putting your protocols under a special protocol assessment. And if you have a rationale for doing it entirely out of the US, that may be something that you would want to discuss with the agency to see if it's acceptable, if you're getting the demographics that would be representative of perhaps a US population, and are there any other concerns, geographic or variations in the disease state that may be specific to the US. So this is a conversation certainly for phase 3 pivotal studies that are going to be instrumental in demonstrating efficacy, those would be the types of questions to be asking during the SPA, the Special Protocol Assessment for the FDA. So certainly it's very common to do international trials. Those are done all the time because of the sheer numbers. But again, in some cases to do it completely without US participants, that would be dependent, I think, on the circumstances of the trial and how the FDA may accept the rationale. But these are all discussion points that you want to have with the agency as you're moving towards progressing those larger pivotal trials.
Great, thank you, Beatrice. And where are the human abuse potential studies conducted? Are they done outside of the US?
No, these are all largely done within North America. And the reason for that is that it is specifically North America, both Canada and the United States, that require the human abuse potential evaluation to begin with. And it requires the recruitment of specific populations, of specific drug users with different types of experience, for example, opioids. And there are different regional country differences in the types of abusers that they have in recreational drug users. So these are predominantly done in America, in the US, as well as in Canada at our site. So these are done exclusively in North America and to fulfill specifically FDA requirements and Health Canada.
Great, and I think we have time for one more question. So what is the process to import IP to North America from Europe, and does this change if the drug is controlled?
Yeah, sure. So the process, if it's not controlled, is fairly similar for Canada and the US. It's really the regulatory approval of that either dossier with an IND or your clinical trial application that will allow you to ship the drug into that country, and it would get released. Although it's not market authorized, it would be released because it's intended for a clinical trial that has been approved. So typically you wait until you have that approval before you ship the drug, and that will ensure that you have clearance and everything else once it gets to the border. If in addition to that there is a narcotic or something that's considered controlled, there is a very similar import-export process across the world. The timing is really what differs depending on what country you're applying to. So if I were to use the example of trying to import something into the US from Europe, the site or the distributor, let's say, with the appropriate licensing would need to apply for an import permit from the DEA. And then once that's been granted, then that is handed over to the right group in Europe, and they would need to apply for an export permit. Once those two permits are granted, then you can ship along with your approval for the trial, and those documents would allow you to bring the drug in. But as I said, the timing can vary depending on the countries that you're actually submitting those permits to.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. Unfortunately, that's all we have time to discuss today. Any remaining questions we will endeavour to answer after the webinar via email. So please join me in thanking Ingrid Holmes and Dr. Beatrice Setnick for their time today. As you leave the webinar, a survey will appear on your screen asking you to rate the session. If you could take a moment to provide your feedback, that would be great. If now is not a good time, the survey will be sent to you via email shortly. If you can complete it when you can, we would greatly appreciate it. On behalf of European Pharmaceutical Review and Altasciences, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.